My call is to the young in heart, regardless of age, to the stout in spirit, regardless of party, to all who respond to the scriptural call, be strong and of good courage, be not afraid, neither be dismayed. For courage, not complacency, is our need today.
He was young in heart and stout in spirit, and courage he had in abundance. We all could see that, or sense it. Those who knew him could see it best of all. Torbert MacDonald, his roommate at Harvard.
You know, many people see him at the summit, the height of his power and glory and all. And it's another thing to see him striving. It looked like he had it easy, that he was born of a rich family and that his father did much for him and all this. And perhaps some of this is true, but most of what he did, in my judgment, he did by himself. He suffered pain. He put up with terrible injury to his back. He never, by one word or one sign, would let you know how badly he was really feeling, nor would he show the emotional feelings that he held so deeply to himself. He wouldn't let them say exactly how deeply he felt about pain, about love, about closeness, about goodness. Many things he'd just fluff off with a wisecrack, something as if it didn't really matter to him when it really mattered very deeply to him.
And so, these are the words of those who knew him, knew what mattered to him, this man who mattered so much to us.
Whatever you were doing seemed to be more fun and more exciting if you're doing it with him.
Lord Harlech, a friend of 25 years.
This vitality which radiated out of him did seem to communicate itself to you, and you always felt in his presence that life was more worth living and was greater fun. Of course, he liked doing whatever he was doing hard.
Charles Spaulding.
He was very conscious of what you could do if you applied yourself, if you made the very most of yourself, if you drove yourself. But at the same time, he had this disarming sense of humor about himself, which is so rare. He had a lightheartedness, a disguise of lightheartedness that masked his seriousness.
Kay Halley knew him most of his life.
You very rarely saw Jack Kennedy at large parties. And if he was, you never saw him dancing very much. He was always off in a corner talking to senators or congressmen or someone that he could learn something from. There was never sort of a frivolous moment, it seemed to me, in his life. You know, you had to improve every shining hour.
William Walton.
He was busy as a bird dog all the time. But he wasn't nervous in the twitchy sense, ever. You just knew that he was tense and charged up by the action. He loved action of every kind and talked about the action, you know. Where's the action?
There was that side of John F. Kennedy, the open, Irish aspect of his personality, charged with vitality, seeking the action. But there was something else, something Kay Halley remembers.
There was always something lonely to me about Jack Kennedy. Whenever you were with him, you always felt an apart, lonely thing in him.
He was born on May 29th, 1917, in Brookline, Massachusetts, a suburb of Boston. His father was the rising assistant manager of a shipyard. His mother was the daughter of a mayor of Boston. John Fitzgerald Kennedy was the second son. Rose Kennedy.
Jack had difficulty with his infant feeding, and then he had scarlet fever when he was only 4 years old. And I think that did affect his childhood a little bit, his health. He was a very normal, happy youngster. I didn't think his IQ was as high as his brother's because I used to work with him a good deal. Joe worked at things harder than Jack.
Jack Kennedy was under the influence and the example of the firstborn. Lemoyne Billings knew them both.
They were about 2.5 years apart, and Joe was always stronger and bigger, and if there was competition, he always beat him.
There was competition. Their father encouraged it. And in his earliest years, Jack Kennedy never came in first, or if he did, only at a price.
One day, they were both sitting at a little table in the dining room, and Mr. Kennedy and I were at the big table. They were having their lunch, and they had cake with chocolate frosting, and Joe took the top of his chocolate frosting off to save it till the end. And just before the end, Jack just reached over and took it, put it in his mouth before anybody could say yes, no. And of course, Joe really whacked him considerably.
The Kennedy family grew to include 9 children, but those in line just after Joe and Jack were girls. The great rivalry was between the 2 older boys, and it continued through grade school in Riverdale, New York, and Choate, a prep school in Wallingford, Connecticut. Seymour St. John, the present headmaster of Choate.
I knew Joe quite well. He was an officer of his class. He was one of the strong boys in the school, thought of highly. He did all the right things. I have a lot of sympathy for Jack Kennedy, whose older brother did everything right, and who, in turn, seemed to do everything just about wrong. He played a lot of touch football, and he got into all informal sports. You see here again, his brother was big, rugged, played varsity football, did everything along the right lines. Jack was too small for that. He only weighed about 135 pounds. He played junior football, and he played on minor teams. I think this perhaps bothered him a little bit, that he couldn't succeed more than he did, or didn't succeed more than he did, in the eyes of adults.
But Jack Kennedy's father pressed him to succeed. He wrote to his son at prep school, "After long experience at sizing up people, I know you have the goods, and you can go a long way. Now, aren't you foolish not to get all there is out of what God has given you?" And the education continued at home, a big red brick house in Bronxville, New York. Thomas Schreiber.
We used to go down there from school, we'd go down there and have lunch on Sundays with family. And there were never less than, 15 or 16 at a Sunday luncheon. And one thing that Mr. Kennedy used to be adamant on was as soon as we finished Sunday dinner, he'd take us into the library. And usually it'd be Eddie Moore, Joe, Jack, and myself. Mr. Kennedy, we'd go in the library and said, "Well, what did you get out of the papers today?" And it got to be we had to spend at least an hour. It used to drive the life out of us because we always wanted to go out and play touch football or get outside. But after this happened several times, we realized we were going to be pumped about what we read in the papers and what was going on, so we'd read them.
Jack Kennedy's best friend of those days, Lemoyne Billings.
Well, Mr. Kennedy would encourage them to argue and stimulate them. And Jack took the New York Times and showed, well, I don't think I know any other kid that subscribed to the New York Times at 14 and 15 and read it every morning. I mean, I don't remember any other kid anyway. He encouraged them to be competitive, and he encouraged them to win. And yet, if they didn't win, they didn't come home to a sour face or a cross look. They just knew that he wanted them to win, and they wanted to win, and he knew how to do it.
Rose Kennedy.
I think his determination to win was encouraged always by his father from the time he was a little fellow, when they all were growing up. Not to be second, because his father would go out and watch the sailboats. And then he'd say, "Why was your sail flapping when the other one was straight? The other one won the race and you didn't." And then they'd say, "Well, we bought our sail 3 years ago." And his father would say, "Well, why don't you tend to those things and find out what's going on? If you're going to race, right, do it right. And come in a winner. Second place is no good."
Yet in some areas of his young life, because of his size or his health or his inclination, he still had to settle for second place. Lemoyne Billings.
He didn't get particularly good marks. He did in the subjects in which he was interested. He did well in history and English and things like that. I think he darn near flunked in physics and math. He hated them.
Jack was apt to concentrate on the things that he was interested in and not bother much about the others. He wanted to make the football team. He was underweight, so he used to smuggle in extra steaks or chocolate milkshakes in order to put on weight.
Torbert MacDonald.
He was great on offense, and could tackle very well on defense, but as far as blocking, that sort of thing where size mattered, he was under, quite a handicap. Guts is the word. He had plenty of guts.
He was sick. He couldn't take part in the athletics very much. I've forgotten what he had then, whether it was jaundice or what it was.
Courtney Hemingway, one of his teachers at Choate.
What it was possibly hepatitis or mononucleosis, something that the doctors didn't know very much about.
Kay Halley.
Joe Kennedy, Sr., asked me if I would stop with him while we were in the hospital to see his young son who was in there, quite ill, with some blood disorder. We went into his bedroom, in his room at the hospital, and you could hardly see Jack. He was so buried in the bed under masses of books, and all I could see was this peaked little face with freckles standing out on the bridge of his nose, this pale little face. And I was awfully interested because the book he was reading then was The World Crisis of Winston Churchill.
He had more than his share of time to read during a long series of childhood illnesses and after a football injury which left him with a bad back. Rose Kennedy.
As he grew older, he did have a lot of trouble with his back. But in those times, he never complained. While the others were out participating in the different games and exercises in the afternoon, he would stay quite contentedly in his room or in the living room there and reading books, and then discussing them all with great enthusiasm during dinner time and asking the opinions of whoever was at dinner, what they thought of John Quincy Adams or Gladstone compared with Disraeli or whatever subject he had been reading.
He graduated from Choate, as his brother had done. He went to London to study economics, as his brother had done. Then Jack Kennedy came home, and for the first time he broke away from the family pattern. Courtney Hemingway.
He admired Joe very much indeed, but you'll notice that he went to Princeton. I think probably Joe Sr., being a loyal Harvard man, was a little disappointed, and possibly faintly Jack was trying to break loose.
He went to Princeton. But if it was a rebellion, it was a very short one. He got sick again, went to Arizona to recover, and then he came back into the family fold. He entered Harvard in the fall of 1936. One of his professors in his freshman year was Arthur Holcomb.
He was a young man who had come to Harvard, as well-heeled young men do, believing it to be an interesting introduction to life, more interested in life than in learning. He stood out among the group that he lived with. They all got by, but he, of course, did much more than get by. But they lived with a crowd that regarded a college education as much more than studying things. They were interested in life.
Torbert MacDonald.
I don't think he really got interested in an intellectual type of academic life until perhaps his junior year, when war seemed to bring to a lot of us, but especially Jack, a realization that, it wasn't all fun and games and that life was about to get very real and very earnest.
That was the year the Nazis marched into Czechoslovakia and the fascists took Albania. Jack Kennedy's father, by now, was ambassador to Britain, and in March 1939 his son sailed across the Atlantic to join him. It was a chance to test out the theory of democratic government as taught at Harvard against the increasingly desperate practice of it in Europe. One of the first friends he made in London was Lord Harlech.
Well, I mostly saw him at parties, in the family circle at home, having a good time. I didn't see much of his serious side. And indeed, at that date, well, of course, he was 21, and I was about the same age. Perhaps neither of us had a very serious side to be seen at that moment. I didn't detect it, although he must have been more interested than I thought, because, of course, he was preparing his book while England slept.
It was a college thesis which he turned into a book during his senior year at Harvard. It represents, he wrote to his father, more work than I've ever done in my life. It represented also an end to the childhood of John F. Kennedy. All the inquisitiveness, the interest in the decisions of history, the passion for study which had been budding in him, now bloomed as he turned his mind to serious affairs. His work at Harvard improved, he graduated cum laude in political science, and his book, which pointed out democracy's weaknesses in the face of totalitarian armies, his book sold 80,000 copies in America and Europe.
He graduated in 40, but the war was on. I mean, we weren't in it, but it was imminent.
Lemoyne Billings.
Just to fill time out, I suppose, he went to Stanford for a year. And during the time at Stanford, then he decided to go into the service.
The Army took one look at his back and turned him down. The Navy accepted him, but gave him a desk job. He appealed to his father for help. And finally, under the combined pressure of Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. and the Japanese Navy, Lieutenant J.G. John F. Kennedy was assigned to the Pacific as skipper of a PT boat.